I teach prehistoric archaeology at the new Bulgarian University and have the pleasure to be the moderator of this session. This is our last meeting for this academic year, and I promise you a strong end of the season with a lecture by Dr. Petya Ilieva entitled Phoenicians and Cypriots in the North, Objects, People and Networks in the North Aegean area in the Geometric and Archaic periods. Petya studied archaeology at Sofia University, where she graduated with a PhD thesis entitled Aegean Trace between Lake Pitsonis and Propontis, 8th-6th century BC. Dr. Petya Ilieva studied also ancient Greek language and literature at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, where she had the chance to work with people such as Professor Michalis Tiverius and many other leading Greek scholars. Dr. Ilieva continued her occupations with the Early Iron Age North Aegean in a framework of a postdoc at University of Oxford with the visitor grant of the British Academy. She is now a researcher at the Institute for Balkan Studies at the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences. Her numerous projects are related with her great passion and field of competence, the Early Iron Age pottery in the North Aegean, the contacts of this area with other regions, and the economic and social transformations at the end of the Geometric and the transition to the Archaic periods. The Phoenicians are so interesting because, in some sense, they never really existed. Phoenicians is a name given in the Early Iron Age by people from the Aegean to people from the Levant. We don't know how did the inhabitants of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos call themselves. That's why today's lecture will give us the opportunity to discuss not only the archaeology of the Early Iron Age North Aegean, the archaeology of mobility, trade, and maritime interaction, but also to think about the creation and appropriation of notions of otherness. And if you are interested in the theory of otherness, personhood, and identity in archaeology, I would warmly recommend you our online course, Archaeology of Identity by Dr. Biserka Gajdarska in our graduate program, which is offered also as a single class. But now, let us move back to the first millennium BC with the Phoenicians and Cypriots in the north, objects, people, and networks in the North Aegean area, in the Geometric and Archaic periods, by Dr. Petya Ilieva. Dear Petya, the floor is yours.
Well, I'd like to welcome everybody and say hello to everybody. I have to admit, I'm very pleasantly surprised that so many people are actually interested in the Northern Aegean. I guess it's actually the Phoenicians and the Cypriots in the Northern Aegean, not the Northern Aegean itself. But I hope you will be interested in the area at the end of my lecture. Now, shall we proceed with?
Yes, please. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, we see it's perfect. You can start.
Thank you. The Northern Aegean is rarely considered in major studies of the Phoenician-Greek commercial interplay, and if so, it's usually in the context of the search of the Phoenician search of metals. The very term Phoenicians is ambiguous, as you know, and seems to denote very fluctuant meanings. Already in the Homeric epics, the Phoenicians were seen as skilled craftsmen, expert sailors, and active traders, but they were also greedy and crafty and even looters and pirates. Subject to so many stereotypes, antique and modern myths, the Phoenicians were seen as the par excellence sailing merchants of the Eastern Mediterranean. The archaeological definition of the people called by the Greeks Phoenicians and the identification of their presence in the Aegean in particular is a very complicated task. While the patchy archaeological record from the Aegean associated with Phoenician activities lacks their clear-cut signature as known from Central and the Western Mediterranean Phoenician establishments, the evidence from the Northern Aegean is even less well-defined and interpreted. Represented by a comparatively small number of diverse finds, it represents a quite interesting case of enlargement of exchange networks in the late geometric and the early archaic periods. These are the periods, as you know, marked by the rise of the polis and the composition of most of the Homeric epics. This is also the time of expanding commercial links in the Aegean and with connecting it with the Eastern Mediterranean. And these links were often facilitated by regional exchange networks and served by mixed cargo ships, possibly with mixed crews as well. This opening of the northern Aegean for objects of Near Eastern origin, let's say, or influences, call for interpretation and brings a couple of quite interesting questions. You can see these questions on the slide. I will repeat them. We can ask ourselves, for example, what objects appear on which sites and in which archaeological contexts. Is it about imports or locally produced influenced goods? If we have imports, where did they come from? How were these exchange networks or network organized? Did people from the late geometric and early archaic northern Aegean have direct contacts with people from Cyprus and the Levantine coast? Or we should imagine the intermediary role of places such as Euboea, the Dodecanese, and the Cyclades. And at the end, did the Cypriots and Phoenicians reach the northern Aegean at all? Some of you probably already know that I have already dealt with these questions in my 2019 paper published in the Open Access Athens University Review of Archaeology, but I have some new ideas which I'd like to share with you today. Now, let's start with the textual evidence. If the information related by the ancient literary sources so vividly describing the nature of the Phoenician presence in the northern Aegean was not available today, one would hardly guess any direct Levantine involvement in the local social and economic landscape. The Iliad provides the two earliest, which means late 8th century BC, mentions of Phoenicians and Phoenician goods, both associating luxury products with northern Aegean locations. The one tells us about richly embroidered garments, work of Sidonian women, which Paris acquired in Sidon and brought home on the ship in which he and Helen traveled. The second episode, this one here, the second episode introduces the Sidonians as skilled craftsmen in making metal vessels. A large silver crater was set by Achilles as a prize in the funeral games of Patroclus. The vessel had a complex history of ownership before that. It was taken by the Phoenicians across the seas, displayed in ports in various ports, and was finally given as a gift to Thos, the Basileus of Lemnos. In both these cases, luxuries, textiles and silver vessel, associated with long-distance seaborne journeys and with the northeastern Aegean, acquired the status of prestigious objects in contrast to the other category of Phoenician goods referred to as athyrmata or trinkets, as you know, but these are mainly in the Odyssey. The episode with the silver crater is more revealing regarding Phoenician practices of exchange. It is suggestive for a form of itinerary trade with ship cargo displayed at various ports for exchange. Approximately 200 years after the time of the Iliad, Herodotus, who lives in the 5th century, gives new information about Phoenician presence in the northern Aegean. According to him, the Phoenicians established themselves on the island of Thasos before the Parian settlers and began the exploitation of the metal mines in the mountains between Koinera and Ainera in the eastern part of the island. Ancient mining galleries were discovered in the location, it should be here in the eastern part of the island, in the location suggested by Herodotus, but no evidence for exploitation predating the end of the 6th and the early 5th century BC has come to light. The place names Ainera and Koinera have repeatedly been recognized in various studies as Phoenician and were connected to the Semitic roots for silver and gold, thus enhancing the impression in favor of Phoenician mining activities on the island. However, a possible link with the name of the Cypriot king Kinyras has also been suggested by Maria Iacovo. I just would like to mention that the time that Herodotus refers to, before the arrival of the Parian Greeks on Tassos, means that we should be thinking of the period of the late 8th century and the very early 7, before the 670, 660, when the colonization of Tassos is usually dated. It's noteworthy that while the Homeric Phoenicians are involved in seaborne itinerary trade with coals at various ports, Herodotus refers to a more permanent form of Phoenician establishment on the island of Tassos, which still lacks material manifestation. The Phoenicians in the Iliad are skilled craftsmen and women associated with manufacture and distribution of luxurious, high-status goods, while those on Tassos are involved in mining. It fits well, though, with the search for metals, which is usually referred to as one of the leading motives for the Phoenician overseas expansion. Herodotus also credits the Phoenicians with the popularity of the Heracles on Tassos. Again, the archaeological record does not match the written sources. The earliest finds from the Heracleon on Tassos date to the end of the 7th and the early 6th century, well after the establishment of the Parian settlers. There is no evidence to confirm a possible Phoenician involvement. The apparent lack of correspondence between the literary testimonies and the archaeology of Tassos has provoked attempts for explanation, such as Lonis, who equated the Phoenicians of Herodotus to people moving from the eastern Aegean coastal sites after the collapse of the Mycenaean palace system. Alternatively, Professor Graham suggested a dominant position of the Phoenicians over the sea routes and seaborne trade in the northern Aegean before the middle of the 7th century. Again, there is no strong archaeological support for such an interpretation. These polarized views on the nature of the Phoenician presence in the northern Aegean, ranging from the total rejection of their historicity to seeing them as masters of the seas in the area, are very indicative that I believe that a more nuanced approach is needed. Before discussing the models of suggested Cypriot and Phoenician involvement in the northern Aegean matters, I would like to recall briefly the evidence regarding the late Bronze Age exchange of metals in the area and the possible Cypriot connection. I perceive it as relevant to the subject, although of an earlier date. A link between Cyprus and the northern Aegean, although still poorly manifested in terms of material evidence, seems, I believe, more promising in the discussion of the Phoenician presence in the northern Aegean, rather than a direct connection with the mainland Phoenician centers. Ox-hide ingots of Cypriot origin and dating probably to the 14th, 13th century BC come from eastern Bulgaria. You can see these on the slide. According to a recent publication, the ingots were carried via exchange networks, with roads playing a very important role as a port of call linking the main axis of the eastern Mediterranean trade to a regional eastern Aegean route leading to the northeastern Aegean and Troy, where other Cypriot finds have also come to light. I would like to emphasize the importance of roads and the eastern Aegean route, maritime link, for the distribution of Cypriot products to the northern Aegean. As I will argue later, this road must have been similarly important in transmitting Cypriot and Phoenician goods, elements of lifestyle, and likely individuals to the north from the late 8th century BC onwards. In fact, a Cypriot link during the final period of the late Bronze Age and the transition to the Iron Age is manifested by a very different category of metal objects. Instead of bulk metals such as the ingots, we now find bronze and bimetal knives in graves on the island of Tassos in the central part of the northern Aegean. The majority of bronze knives discovered in 12th century graves at the location of Kastri on the island belong to Aegean types made of imported copper, which falls within or very close to the Cypriot field according to the isotope analysis. Except for copper knives, also bimetallic knives made of copper and iron elements were found on the island in graves dated by Kukuli Hrisantaki, by the researcher, in the late 12th and the 11th century BC. These mark the earliest appearance of iron on the island, and the chemical composition of their bronze handles indicates a most likely origin of the copper, again within the Cypriot field. Later on, during the 10th century, the extraction and processing of iron apparently gained a very important role for the local community, judging by the iron objects and large number of iron slugs found in the graves. Two important points should be emphasized. First, the suggested connection with Cyprus, which may have provided the impetus for the beginning of the iron metallurgy on Thasos. And secondly, the native metalworking on Thasos during the 2.5 centuries preceding the arrival of the Parians was in the hands of the local population. The 8th and the very early 7th century coastal pre-colonial settlement, which is below the later Parian Apoikia on the northern coast of the island, northeastern, these levels, the pre-colonial levels, have also provided abundant evidence for the mining and extraction of metals from the neighboring hill of the later Acropolis. And it suggests that extraction of metal was a very important occupation for the local community. Here you can see a photograph of the trench. It was a small trench, but with you can see the black layers with very dense remains of suggesting extraction, metallurgical activities and extraction of metals. But there is no evidence for production of metal finds, just the initial phase, the extraction. There seems to be a gap between the 12th and the early 11th century BC contacts of the local population on Thasos with the Aegean, and the renewal of these contacts with the Aegean neighbors in the second half of the 8th century BC, when the island becomes part of a more locally developed Northern Aegean exchange network. The early Cypriot and Phoenician finds at Lefkandi in the late 11th century and the gradually increasing number of Levantine imports or influenced objects that we find from the 10th and 9th century, Euboea and the southern Aegean places such as the Dodekanes and Crete, these did not reach the Northern Aegean. Let me focus now on the main subject of my lecture, the late geometric and the early archaic periods. The archaeological definition of a possible Cypriot and Phoenician presence in the Northern Aegean, as I've already mentioned, is a complicated task, and the still modest number of artifacts provide a basis for discussion. It seems very likely, as I suggested, that Phoenician materials reached the Northern Aegean via or from Cyprus itself. For this reason, the Phoenician and Cypriot imports from the area will be presented together. Furthermore, there is a clear difference in the distribution patterns of Cypriot and Phoenician objects in the northwestern corner of the Aegean, here on one side, and in the central and northeastern part of the Northern Aegean, from the Acte Peninsula to the Troadic coast on the other side. The archaeological evidence from the northwestern Aegean. Fragments of 6 Phoenician trade amphorae, I've illustrated 2 of these, have come to light from the earliest deposit of a subterranean structure called Hypogeon, dated to 730, between 730 and 690 BC, and excavated in ancient Metonia. Their fabric and technological feature indicated that their origin in the Phoenician homeland. This makes them the only group of securely identified metropolitan Phoenician ware discovered in the Northern Aegean so far. And here you can see a section drawing of the structure where the amphora, as well as other finds, were discovered. The Metonic Aegean is also the source of two types of glass beads, which have been usually associated with Phoenician craftsmanship and trade activities. But such beads have come to light from other sites, northern Aegean sites as well. The compound, the so-called 3-eye beads, the triangular, dated to the late 8th and 7th century, are traditionally associated with Phoenician craftsmanship, but a link between their distribution and Euboean trade activities and settlements abroad was also suggested, while a Rhodian workshop, on the other hand, has been advocated as well. Furthermore, the excavation of the Metonic Aegean has produced evidence that glassmaking workshop was active at the site as early as the colony's foundation. In this case, a local production stimulated through the Euboean connection, or perhaps by early contacts with Rhodes, seems very likely. The second type of beads, you can see them here on the top row, includes undecorated, transparent, greenish and bluish round and biconical beads. Similar beads were found in central Macedonia and appear on the island of Lemnos as well, which again could be an indication for the role of one or more coastal local workshops rather than a direct Phoenician import. The excavation of the Aegean has brought to light other classes of artifacts, such as glass vases, faience, pendants, and ivories, which could possibly be linked to Phoenician workshops and trade activities. The excavator, Matthäus Basius, argued for the existence of an ivory workshop operating from the early days of the colony. Like the possible evidence for an early glass workshop, the indication for an ivory one posed the problem of the local manufacture versus the imports. And another find, an Egyptianizing amulet, was also discovered during the Aegean excavation at Metone, suggesting that it was discarded at the same time as the rest of the finds, which means the late 8th and the very early 7th century. It recalls the Sekhmet-type figurines with lioness head and ureus between the ears, and could be tentatively identified as representation of this mother goddess of the Memphis triad. It was suggested, and here I mean the study of Richard Fletcher, that the distribution of the Egyptianizing amulets, often associated with Phoenician manufacture and trade in the Aegean and the Mediterranean, followed certain patterns. A concentration of Memphis triad, figurines of the Memphis triad, is clearly noticeable in Tyrrhenian Italy and Eastern Aegean sites, while only single ones are known from Spain, North Africa, Sardinia, and Sicily. It has also been established that the majority of the Memphis triad amulets date to the 8th and the first half of the 7th century, which accords well with the context date of the figurine discovered in Metone. Richard Fletcher links the distribution of the Memphis triad Egyptianizing amulets to distinctive he calls it North Phoenician trade routes exploited in cooperation with the Euboeans. Considering the presence of other Phoenician and Phoenician-type objects discovered in the Aegean, and the fact that Methonia was an Euboean establishment, the figurine could be seen in the light of the suggested North Phoenician Euboean cooperation. Another site, Karaburnaky, a northern Aegean port in modern Thessaloniki, where Phoenician as well as Cypriot ceramics were discovered. You can see here two joining mouth and neck fragments from a trefoil red-slipped jug dated to about 700 BC, and they appear to belong to a familiar type of Phoenician jugs. Its micaceous fabric suggested that it was possible southeastern Aegean version of the Phoenician shape. You can see it here, rather than an original import from the Phoenician homeland. Of course, a Phoenician pot found in the northern Aegean and manufactured in the eastern Aegean would point towards a link between these two parts of the Aegean rather than a direct one between the northern Aegean and the Phoenician coast. It still does not mean, however, that this link could not have been carried by the agency of Phoenician people resident in the eastern Aegean, Rhodes, for example, or at least on mixed ship crews. The same settlement, Karaburnaki, did also provide two body fragments from black or red vases. You can see them. Likely these were identified as Negrid juglets of Cypriot manufacture, as well as one more Cypriot decorated pottery fragment. Two golden earrings, I've illustrated only the one, with granulation from Karaburnaki and dated to about 700, belong to the Mulberry type with parallels in Cyprus and Levantine sites. We continue with the ceramic evidence. Mouth and neck fragments of two small perfume vessels dated to the first half of the 7th century were found in Torone. You can see it here. A Phoenician manufacture was suggested for the first one, although a possible origin in Cyprus or even the Dodecanese was allowed. And here, I mean, it was suggested again by Richard Fletcher. The second fragment he attributed to Cypriot greyware polished ware. A rare non-ceramic evidence for Cypriot trade activities was discovered in Mende, you can see it here, on Halkidiki. A late 8th and early 7th century BC Attic SOS amphora was used as a burial container. A short inscription incised on its shoulder in Cypriot syllabary contains part of a personal name, which is interpreted as the name of the trader or the owner of the amphora, followed by a patronym and the beginning of a place name identified as Salaminios from Salamis by origin. The vessel also bears three incised vertical lines on the handle, a practice popular on the island for marking the capacity of the containers. The Mende inscription finds an almost identical early 7th century parallel in one from South Italy, which makes a possible common Cypriot background for the two containers not unlikely. Moving to the central and the eastern part of the northern Aegean, we find, I think, a rather different picture. The early Clazomenian cemetery of Abdera, you can see Abdera, has produced an isolated basket handle transport amphora dated to the second half of the 7th century. This type of containers originated in Cyprus and represents a comparatively rare find in the early Archaic Aegean. Especially for the northern Aegean, it is something possibly important. The Cypriot amphora discovered in the Aegean usually come from sites with strong Levantine associations such as Komos and Rhodes. Also, three archaic shipwrecks off the shore of South and Southwest Turkey with cargoes dominated consistently by Cypriot basket handle amphora, but also carrying East Greek transport containers. They provide more evidence on the expanding seaborne relations between the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean in the early Archaic period. The remaining evidence from Lemnos, from the islands of Lemnos, Tenedos, and also Troy, manifests an interesting phenomenon which I perceive as very indicative for the substantial differences in the mechanisms linking each part of the northern Aegean to the Aegean commercial networks and the possible presence of Cypriot and Levantine tradesmen in the Aegean far north. The 8th city of Troy is the source of a most probably locally made trefoil mounted jug and handle fragments from presumably similar jug, but they are not associated with this one, datable to the first half of the 7th century. It belongs to the local so-called Northwest Anatolian greyware. The shape, which is alien to the repertory of the local greyware, is that of a group of Phoenician red slip trefoil-lipped jugs. The jug from Troy is very closely comparable to a number of examples from Cyprus and the Phoenician mainland. The double rope handle fragment, this one, and the round knob on the other fragment at the base of the triple rope one can be found on Phoenician jugs from Cyprus. not this particular type, but the type of handle. The manufacturing of the Trojan jug introduces the problem of the copies or imitations. A locally made Anatolian greyware vase was most likely designed for the local market. Unlike the Karaburnaki jug, which even if made in the southeastern Aegean is red-slipped, thus reproducing the visual impression of the Phoenician red-slipped class, the Trojan vase follows the local traditions in terms of fabric and surface finish. Its shape is very well rendered, and details such as the ridge at the neck body transition are not omitted. The potter must have had a very good visual knowledge of this particular form, perhaps from important original, which could have been a ceramic or even a metal version of the shape, as they are also very popular. Local emulations of earlier and contemporaneous Cypriot and Levantine shapes can be recognized in several vases originating from the island of Lemnos and Tenedos, and suggesting a good level of familiarity with ceramic vessels originally manufactured in the Eastern Mediterranean. The late 8th and 7th century cemetery on the island of Tenedos is the source of burnt ascoi. You can see two of these here, manufactured again in the tradition of the Northwest Anatolian greyware. The shape, which was popular on Cyprus in the 11th century, was introduced to Aegean centers with strong connections with the East, such as Crete, Euboea, and the Dodecanese. Their local production, the local production there stopped relatively quickly towards the end of the 10th century, but it continued down to the late geometric period in the Dodecanese on the island of Kos, when it, I already mentioned, it had stopped elsewhere in the Aegean. It is very likely, therefore, that the local greyware burnt ascoi from Tenedos were influenced by contemporaneous examples from places such as Rhodes and Kos, rather than from Cypriot originals. A ring vase from the same burial ground enhances the impression that the local inhabitants were familiar with vases of Cypriot and of Cypriot inspiration, but not necessarily direct origin. Now, the late 8th and the 7th century cemetery of Hephaestia on Lemnos is the source of a single vase which appears to follow, by this I mean this one here, to follow the general shape of the Cypriot basket handle amphora. The Lemnian example, which comes from a late 7th century grave, is a small size, most likely local version of the shape. Similar small-size basket handle amphora are known from Camerus and Lindus on Rhodes, as well as from some Levantine sites, all from either burial or sanctuary contexts. The Lemnian example, come from a grave with where anthropomorphic lid of probably Rhodian origin was also found, which again enhances the impression that the Dodecanese and perhaps Rhodes in particular acted as an important location in the transmission of Cypriot and Levantine objects and influences to the northeastern corner of the Aegean. A group of banded jugs, this one here, supported by low stands from the Cabirion on Lemnos and dated to after the middle of the 7th century BC, find good parallels in Syrian and Phoenician examples. You can see this one here, as well as more stands from Lemnos and their Eastern Levantine parallels. Similarly, a jug from Myrina on Lemnos, it was found early in 1906, possibly most likely a grave find. It compares, the shape is unparalleled in the northern Aegean, but it compares closely to an earlier Phoenician bronze jug, for example, from the Idaean cave on Crete, on the island of Crete. Another indirect suggestion for familiarity with Eastern habits comes from two graves from the so-called Area A of the cemetery of Hephaestia, dated generally to the second half of the 8th and the early 7th century. Oh, I do apologize. Both graves share similar equipment, which includes an iron so-called trunnion axe of relatively small size, about 11 centimeters is this one, and a set of golden jewelry, which includes pieces such as thin bands or diadems, earrings, especially golden and bronze fibulae, as well as ceramic vases such as pyxides, amphorisco, and juglets. This is the one grave, and here is the second one, again the axe. This one I think is 12 centimeters. This is a golden fibula, and the rest of the golden jewelry. This grave also contains a sort of a squat globular clay pierced object with a 6-leaf rosette and a meandering relief. Now, I'd like to refer here to a suggestion that this sort of axis, this type of axis, were used mainly as working tool, especially in carpentry, for example, rather than as a weapon. I also would like to mention that these graves do not contain weapons, unlike other graves with jewelry from the Aegean. Although many other graves from the Hephaestia cemetery contain iron axes, none of the other graves has these combined with fine jewelry and earrings in particular. Necklaces as well. In a recent discussion of the early Iron Age graves from Athens and Lefkandie with working tools, Professor Donofrios suggested that the combination of working tools, that axes, weapons, as well as jewelry, and especially the earrings and necklaces, she suggested that these were actually male graves, while the presence of personal adornments points to people familiar with Eastern Mediterranean elite lifestyle, in which earrings were a normal male attribute. And here you can see the Syrian wall painting, which is contemporaneous to the Lemnian finds, 8th century. Although the examples from Lemnos are later than the Athenian and the finds from and the graves from Lefkandien, the combination of objects is comparable to these examples, as well as to some Cypriot and Levantine graves. Wall painting from Syria, as I already mentioned, contemporaneous to the Lemnian graves, represents male figures wearing earrings and diadems. Whether the individuals in both Lemnian graves were Easterners settled on the island or locals accustomed to, for various reasons, to Eastern elements in lifestyle, one of these people who were used to switch between different cultures, so to speak, it could be a subject of a very long debate. Interestingly, one of the graves contains a golden fibula, this one, which recalls Odysseus' golden fibula, which is the only male jewelry known from the epics. Finally, this clay object with the rosette and meander from the same grave, it resembles, at least to my eye, it resembles a pierced steatite disc from Lindus, which Blinkenberg compared to engraved stones from Asia Minor and northern Syria. The equipment of two more graves from this time from the so-called Area B of the cemetery of Hephaestia, which is dated to the mid and late 7th century, also points to links with the Eastern Mediterranean, again possibly via the Dodecanese. The first grave, it also has iron axes, golden jewelry. including one earring, a diadem, and a necklace, similar to the earlier graves. It also contained glass and faience beads, faience base pendants of varying size for a necklace, two objects of soft chalky limestone, and a number of containers such as alabaster and pyxidis. The second grave, it is one of the richest graves in the cemetery, contained the already mentioned small size, possibly local version of a Cypriot basket handle amphora. To this, I will add an iron axe. It's not illustrated in the publication, so I cannot illustrate it. And a knife. This is what's left from the knife. Golden earring. Here also, glass and faience beads, a carved bone arm. It's this one here, and the hand. It's an arm with a hand comparable to one from Lindos. This is the example from Lindos, as well as a clay lid ending in a female head, likely from a pyxis. This is the lid. Pyxis with an anthropomorphic female lid comes from Rhodes, and it's dated to about 700 BC. Although the two examples differ stylistically due to the chronological differences, the concept may have reached Lemnos again from Rhodes. One may also add comparable jugs from Rhodes with anthropomorphic necks. Interestingly, the anthropomorphic lid from Rhodes covers a pyxis which imitates Syro-Phoenician ivory prototypes, while the jugs with anthropomorphic necks represent local versions, Rhodian versions of Cypriot types. One can only guess what type of vessel exactly the Lemnian lid covered. And here you can see a piece of a clay figurine from the cemetery on the island of Tenedos. I've put it on the slides with the finds from this grave because to my eye it resembles very closely stylistically the Lemnian lid. But the interesting thing is that like the bird ascoi, it was manufactured in the fabric of the Anatolian grey ware. A pair of discs made of golden foil, decorated with concentric circles and triple spirals, were discovered in another grave in the cemetery of Hephaestion Lemnos, which was dated towards the late 8th or the first half of the 7th century. Similar discs come from earlier Middle and late proto-geometric burials in Lefkandi and Skiros, and were attributed to a workshop which may have operated in Lefkandi. On the other side, the discs were associated by other scholars with North Syrian and Phoenician prototypes. It was pointed out that it's not clear if the finished products actually traveled as part of commercial cargo, or the matrices were used by itinerant craftsmen from North Syria and Phoenician or the Phoenician coast, similarly to those working on places such as Cyprus and Rhodes. In this case, if this was the case, a short-term establishment of traveling goldsmiths on Lemnos, working in the tradition of the Eastern Mediterranean, can also be imagined. Now, let's move to the discussion of the possible networks linking the Northern Aegean to the South and the Eastern Mediterranean, the South Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean. This overview of the archaeological record indicates that apart from the late Bronze Age ingots and even later bronze and bimetal knives from Tassos, suggesting a Cypriot link, it was not before the late 8th century when artifacts of Cypriot and Phoenician origin, or perhaps more correctly associations, reached the Northern Aegean. The late 8th century BC seems to be the likely time that Homer's mentioning of the Phoenicians in the Northern Aegean refers to. During that same period, The exchange networks linking the southern Aegean with the eastern Mediterranean were increasingly expanding. The Phoenicians acquired a better articulated commercial and craftsmen's presence, especially in the Dodecanese. It is during this same dynamic period when Rhodes begins to enter the already established exchange networks, while the Euboeans are still active. The Aegean of the late 8th century focused on active, most probably multi-ethnic exchange of goods, technologies, and knowledge, facilitated not just by commercial mechanisms but by mobility of people as well. It would be therefore constraining to try and associate the evidence from the northern Aegean with a specific ethnic group. The spread of Cypriot and Phoenician finds around the Thermaic Gulf and Chalkidiki could be seen in the light of the Euboean activities and interests in the northern Aegean, with Methone providing the richest evidence at present. The area may have been part of a northern branch of Aegean commercial networks connecting the southern Aegean, Euboea, Skyros, and the Thermaic Gulf. The suggested glassmaking and ivory workshops at Methone may imply a possible presence of Phoenician or Phoenician trained craftsmen almost from the beginning of this Euboean establishment. Similarly, a short-term presence of goldsmiths working in North Syrian or Phoenician tradition on lemnos is possible. Likewise, the discussed Lemnian graves indicate a familiarity with Eastern lifestyle. The Sekhmet figurine from Methone could also be brought in the discussion. One could speculate that it may have been a personal belonging of an Easterner. The growing body of evidence for resident Easterners in geometric and early archaic Aegean places such as Lefkandi, Rhodes, Crete, and Corinth suggests that these people, and craftsmen in particular, were supplying Levantine-style products to the Aegean customers. Although similar pattern in the northern Aegean must have been on a much smaller scale, the presence of some individuals from the eastern Mediterranean is not entirely impossible. The Phoenician presence in the Aegean has been seen as an example of enoikismos, with Levantine people integrated in the local communities, rather than establishing settlement, and the northern part of the Aegean must have followed a similar pattern, I believe. As I already mentioned at the beginning, John Graham argued for a leading role played by the Phoenicians in the northern Aegean exchange networks, connecting the distribution of a regional subgeometric water group known as G2-3 to their maritime activities. Although this statement is probably going too far, it's an interesting coincidence, if it is a coincidence at all, that the distribution map of the G2-3 overlaps with the map of sites where Cypriot, Phoenician, and Phoenician type finds have come to light. Both sets of evidence, whether put together or viewed separately, are certainly indicative of a dynamic regional maritime exchange network. On the other hand, the variety of Eastern Mediterranean finds from the northern Aegean takes the discussion to the wider Aegean system of trade networks. The limited volume and diverse nature of finds of Eastern Mediterranean origin or inspiration in the northern Aegean suggests that their distribution in the area could be the end result of the activity of intersecting regional exchange networks with ports of trade facilitating mixed merchandise cargoes. Cyprus, with its mixed demographic background, maritime expertise, long-lasting commercial experience, and favorable location, provides a natural intersecting point for the Levantine and Southern Aegean trade routes. The archaeological evidence from the central and eastern part of the northern Aegean suggests different routes of distribution of Eastern Mediterranean goods and patterns of interaction with possible Easterners in the north. The role Euboea played in the northwestern corner of the Aegean was already emphasized, but the archaeological evidence suggests that the Euboeans did not venture east of Sithonia Peninsula, of Chalkidiki. So the southeastern Aegean ports of trade, and roads in particular, must have played an important role in transmitting Eastern Mediterranean goods and influences to the northeastern part of the Aegean. The Lemnian evidence allows for the assumption that there were some resident perhaps temporarily or maybe even permanent, Easterners or a strong influence. Lemnos, which was an important production center of metal objects at that time, did very likely establish a strong link with Tassos as a source of metal towards the end of the 8th century BC. A result of such intensive collaboration might be the almost identical ceramic assemblage of both islands, if not identical, let's say very closely linked, in the late 8th and the 7th centuries. The association of many Lemnian artifacts with Rhodes, on the other hand, indicates the possible departure points or the point of Cypriot and Phoenician goods that reached the north via an eastern route. This Rhodes may have been an important link between the central and the eastern part of the northern Aegean on one side and the eastern Mediterranean on the other side, similarly to the role that Euboea played for the northwestern part of the Aegean. On the other side, I'm thinking that the link between which the Lemnian finds suggest the link with Rhodes on one side and the link with Tassos on the other side may actually account for the Herodotus' story about the Phoenicians on Tassos. If I had to look for Phoenicians somewhere in the northern Aegean, it would have been Lemnos and not Tassos. This was my suggestion for contextualization of Cypriot and Levantine objects in the northern Aegean, of the quite vibrant 8th and 7th century BC, and until we get a scientific data, which I don't expect soon, the question about the presence and agency of Phoenician or simply Cypriot and Levantine merchants will remain open. So thank you very much for your attention. I would like also to thank the Balkan Heritage Foundation and New Bulgarian University, our host, for inviting me to present this lecture to such an international, let's say, audience. And I hope that you enjoyed it and that it was somehow useful.
Thank you very much, Petya. I've enjoyed it very much. Thank you for this quite detailed and very serious review of imported and influenced objects of Cypro-Levantine origin in the early Iron Age North Aegean. And for me, who is not a specialist in early Iron Age, it was quite a release to convincingly to see convincing arguments that it's not only the Phoenicians, which means one agency doing everything, but that we have different agencies, probably people coming to the Aegean, but also contacts with Euboea, contacts with Rhodos. So this process, which was called by Professor Andreu in his paper in the Lemos and Kotsonas, edited by them, companion, like becoming cosmopolitan, is a complicated process with interweaving agencies. So now I would invite all the attendees to process to discussion. Petya, would you like to unshare your screen?
Yes, of course.
The discussion is not recorded. We are not going to put it on YouTube, so please feel free to say whatever you think. And I would suggest to kind of structure it a little bit. So I would suggest to first start with questions referring to archaeological contexts, material, and then to move to more general questions related to theory, organization of contact, Phoenicians. So we would like to hear your voice and, if possible, to see your face. We'll do it pretty easy, so please either raise your hand or just write in the chat questions. Don't write the entire question. And speak with Petya. Floor is open for discussion.
This has been very clear. If there are no questions.
There might be no questions related with specific artifacts, finds, imports. So let's process let's move to every kind of questions, whatever. I see a question from Karl Schneider. Have any archaeological sites with early metallurgical smelting 12th, 11th century BC been found? Petya.
I guess you mean a site in the northern Aegean.
Probably yes.
I cannot recollect. All the evidence is later. The earliest is that from Tassos, but the iron, the evidence for iron metallurgy there is, I can't recollect, but earlier than the 10th century BC. The only earlier iron from Tassos is the one which is on the imported knives, which are probably most likely Cypriot, at least according to the analysis of the metals.
Thank you. And Maria Lopez asks, we have nothing in Samothrace?
Samothrace figures very prominently in the literary sources, in the written sources, and the mythology connects it with Cadmos, who stopped on Samothrace in his search of Europe. But archaeologically, no. The earliest, apart from the prehistoric settlement there, and the late bronze, very early Iron Age settlement excavated, a small part of it, it hasn't produced anything linked to Phoenicians. Then the earliest evidence for contacts with the rest of the Aegean comes from the sanctuary of the great gods. This is pottery of 7th century, probably mid-7th century date, and it's strongly linked to Lemnos. The influence there comes from Lemnos.
We have another question or comment by Nancy Surwitt. I find it interesting that some of the figurines found in the northeastern Aegean reflect Egyptianizing tendencies as transmitted by the Phoenicians. Is there any figural style seen in the figurine corpus that reflects Syro-Palestine stylistic sources?
Well, the figurines that I know of, there are actually very few. My lecture is based on published materials, so if they're somewhere in the museums unpublished. I'm not aware of such. But I can't be sure what's in the museums.
Thank you. I don't see raised hands. The problem might be with me. Let me check again. I'm very happy as a Bronze Age guy that Lemnos appears on the scene after playing a quite important role in the early Bronze Age and then in the Middle Bronze Age. Again, obviously, the late geometric and archaic period, it's a time for Lemnians to engage. Another?
I think they're underestimated very much.
Yes, there is something happening in the chat from Carol Schneider. How do estimates of terrestrial trade volumes in the geometric and archaic periods volumes compare with estimates of maritime trade volumes? Was most trade overland or by sea? A difficult question.
Well, if we're looking for evidence for trade, or generally speaking, connection with the southern Aegean and the eastern Mediterranean, it's evidently by sea. Of course, there must have been local northern Aegean overland trade routes, and they must have been active, although I think they were more, or at least the evidence that we have is that there were more such routes and links in the area of between the Thermaic Gulf, the Halkidiki Peninsula, and the island of Tassos, for example. I think that the overland route through Halkidiki and then Tassos must have been quite active. Although in the northeastern Aegean, for the moment, I mean, the islands suggest really a seaborne trade mainly.
If I can add something, there are people who are much more competent than me here and might correct me, but as far as I know, on Lemnos, there are no metal sources. So no, everything comes in.
That's why I believe
entire metal process, how process, we don't know, but comes from Tassos or from elsewhere.
I think that my conclusions about the link between Lemnos and Tassos are based on the examination of pottery, because this is what we're left with. There are no analysis, as far as I know, of metal finds found on Lemnos. It will be very good if we have such a result. But for the moment, the pottery of both islands suggests a very strong link. And I think the pottery was, it's not the most important reason for the connection between the two islands. It must have been the metals. Yes. Tassos as a source and Lemnos as an important production center.
Thank you. Professor Maya Vasilyeva has a question.
Hi, Petya. Congratulations. I enjoyed the lecture very much. I would like to ask about a possible hypothesis. Could you concern that just 17 objects or 17 elements could have provoked the Greeks and the Greek authors to write Phoenician? And what about the temple, the sanctuary of Hercules on Tassos? Could be just the Easterner, the Levantine, the Easterner look had proposed these statements by the ancient authors.
Well, I think the very use of the word Phoenicians, it had triggered the ancients like it does with us today, because we can't actually catch them. Regarding Tassos, there is no, from a purely archaeological point of view, there is no evidence. There are some ivories, but they were found in the Artemision of Tassos, not the Heraclean. But these ivories, their date is very disputable, and as far as I know, they were dated towards the end of the 7th century, which means this is the time when the Parthian Greeks are already on the island. So these ivories cannot be really a clear hint or a link to
Okay.
possible Easterners on the island.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Still enigmatic, these words by Herodotus.
Yes, I'm not sure how well he was informed regarding the Phoenician statuses, but
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Maya. We have a comment and a question by Susan Sherratt, one of the most renowned authors dealing with Phoenicians, and also the author of a very long and extensive paper appeared 2020 in, again, the same companion to Greek archaeology. I believe that the main attraction for Easterners in the North Aegean was the silver, for example, from Tassos, the Chalkidike, and the area around Pangaeon. Abdera too provides access to silver sources for the north. We have evidence for the exploitation of silver on Tassos in the early Bronze Age and in the Chalkidike in the Archaic period, but little concrete evidence so far in between. Would you agree that silver was a particularly important attraction?
I would agree that it could have been. I don't deny it, but as far as we still lack any archaeological, let's say, material evidence for the moment, I can't say it was, because I cannot support my words. It's very attractive, but for me, it's a hypothesis. Yeah, but it's possible because these are places which are. I know that it's not a strong argument, but exactly these places, Tassos, Pangaeon, the mythology links them with Phoenicians. Pangaeon is also linked with the Phoenician Kavnos. And that's why I mentioned, although it's not really linked with silver, but if we look at the distribution map of the so-called G23, where it coincides exactly, matches the distribution of the present the distribution of Cypriot and Phoenician artifacts or such associated with Cyprus or Phoenicia in the northern Aegean. So there was a link between these sites. Whether they were also exploiting and trading in silver, yes, it's possible, but we can't tell for sure right now.
I see in the audience Dr. Nerantzis, whom I don't have the pleasure to know personally, but he has a first-hand, he works on Tassos. If you want to add something on this point, might do so. If not, let's move to the other questions. Peter Zidarov, no one wants to speak. Let me read with my French accent. Thanks for the great lecture, Petya. Can you tell us something about the repertory? The do I hear Greek? Yes, Dr. Nerantzis. Yes.
Excuse me, sorry for that. I was not really prepared for replying to any question. I'm sorry about that, but well,
just you want to drop something in the comment or so.
I agree. First of all, congratulations to Petya Ilieva for this very interesting and stimulating presentation. For what I have been doing in the past, looking at metallurgy in Tassos, it is really true that in the early Bronze Age, we have quite sophisticated silver extraction technologies, because there's some finds related to the cupellation process, which is the process that separates lead from silver in this secondary step of the chaîne opératoire of extracting the silver. And these finds are coming from the southwestern part of the island, the settlement of Limenaria. And then suddenly this technology somehow becomes, just disappears from the island until the coming of the Greeks, and then the establishment of the Parian colony, and then the large-scale massive extraction of the silver deposits on the western side of the island. Indeed, as Petya has just mentioned, there is a gap between the early Bronze Age and the Archaic period. So we don't really know what is going on during these long centuries of in terms of extracting silver. What I would also, I just wanted to add here one technological issue on that. A lot of papers have been published on silver extraction of the Phoenicians in Spain. So when the Phoenicians went there, the deposits they have been exploiting had been jarosites, which are quite different than the ones in Lavrion, because Lavrion ores that is galena is also containing lead. So it is easier to extract silver from a galena deposit because the lead is there to help somehow the metallurgist, because lead really works as a collector of the silver, and then it's easier to extract it in the second stage. With a lack of lead in Spain, Phoenicians seem to have imported lead from other mines wherever they were extracting the silver. So there seems to be some kind of technological preference into going to particular deposits, or maybe it was out of necessity. Of course, the Spanish deposits are huge in comparison to those in Thasos. Thasos doesn't have so rich silver deposits, but nonetheless, there seemed to have been some kind of technological association between the Levantine Phoenicians with the Cypriots, maybe. Some articles by Jonathan Wood lately have been published looking at how silver extraction from the Levant and Cyprus as well might have been in collaboration. We are not sure what is happening in Lavrion at this period again, another interesting case where Lavrion is also active for the extraction of silver in the early Bronze Age. And then into the Iron Age, there's not a lot of information coming from excavations. But to close that quickly, I just would be very interested if more finds come up in the islands of the north, particularly in Thasos or other sites that might bridge this gap that exists for the moment. Thank you again very much for this excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Ah, sure. Hi, now I can see you. Such a pleasure.
Can I just say that the work Jonathan Wood has been doing sheds all kinds of doubt on the results of lead isotope analysis on silver because of this habit of, at least in Spain, of bringing lead from elsewhere and combining it with the silver before cupellation.
Exactly. Well, this is really a very interesting question. I guess in the future we'll have more to learn on how to really decipher lead isotopes, and maybe looking at it in association with trace elements analysis. And maybe now the recent work that has been done is silver isotopes. This big ERC project run by Albared in Lyon, in the École Normale Supérieure Lyon, they are developing a new technique of analyzing silver isotopes. This might be the way forward.
If it works, yes.
Thank you, Professor Susan, for this.
Thank you. Sue, is there something else you would like to add, or we move forward? Okay.
I have silver on the brain at the moment.
Okay, now then we move forward with Peter Zidarov's question. Thanks for this great lecture, Petya. Can you tell us something about the repertory of the ivory workshop in Metone? Did they work in local style or in Eastern Mediterranean fashion?
We are still waiting for the full publication of the Metone finds, because for the moment we only know the corpus of inscribed fragments, the inscription. I don't know if you noticed on one of my slides with the Metone finds with the Egyptianizing amulet, there was also an ivory object. This is what I've seen, it's published, and the excavators they advocate that the finds suggest the possible workshop, but no more finds, as far as I know, have been published, and I hope they're preparing the next volume of the Metone publications. The material that comes from the Apogeo is huge and very interesting, not just the inscriptions.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry for interrupting you. Most of you already know this. It's the most important problem, let's say, of the modern Aegean archaeology, that we're still waiting for substantial corpora to be published that will give us a better understanding, let's say, of the area.
It's fantastic. We have in the chat a text by Adam Di Battista, who says, I've studied the majority of the Metone ivory assemblage. Most of the assemblage is production waste. The few finished objects are strongly consistent with Greek ivory works of the 7th century in sanctuaries.
Okay,
So,
thank you.
Thank you. There was a question I missed, yes, by Mladen Rachev. Most foreign, in inverted commas, objects presented here are grave goods. Isn't this an evidence for objects traveling but not people? Could these Levantine types objects be produced on Euboea and Rhodes?
Most of these, yes, could have been, but it still doesn't mean that they could not have been produced by Levantine or Cypriot people on Rhodes, for example. And how they travel to the northern Aegean. That's why several times I mentioned the mixed cargoes on the ships and possibly mixed crews. So that an object was produced on Rhodes doesn't make it, I think, less Phoenician or less Cypriot. Exactly like a greyware jug from Lesbos is no less greyware than one from Troy. Of course, the objects cannot tell us clearly that the people also traveled, but I personally do not believe that the ships transporting these objects had only Greek crew, let's say, and only Greeks were sailing north and bringing these objects. I think that the picture was far more dynamic and very different people were reaching the area. Which is why, because we don't have Phoenician settlements like in Central or the Western Mediterranean, this is what makes finding them so difficult. They were sort of incorporated into the local settlements and between the local inhabitants. We can't find them. And I just like to remind a very important, to my mind, parallel. If it wasn't for the written sources telling us about the passing of the great Persian army through Thrace on their way south to Greece, judging by the archaeology, we would have never guessed that Persians have been along the northern Aegean coast. But we all believe that this happened, and we don't question it. While when it comes to other Easterners, the Phoenicians, suddenly we don't believe that they were there. I mean, many people don't believe. Objects we all know it's very difficult to equate objects to people. I personally believe that there were Eastern people, possibly not a lot, but still there were in places such, especially Lemnos is the place for them.
If I may add something, Mladen Rachev asks something which, of course, comes immediately as a question in the head of a prehistoric archaeologist. Should we suspect behind every bottle of French wine and of perfume a Frenchman or French lady coming to 19th century Europe? And of course, the question is no. But on the other hand, if we see what the new data about human mobility in continental Bronze Age Europe is based on DNA, we see pattern. It's not about migration. It's just women coming from 200 kilometers, 150 kilometers to marry, for example. So to me, there is absolutely no doubt that people from the North Aegean went to Cyprus, or people from Cyprus come to the North Aegean. But the very important question is, when does this start affecting first the archaeological record, because they came but was never buried in this way, in their way. And second, when do these human mobility start to affect trade networks and this opening of the North Aegean we speak about? Okay. Are there other questions? Thank you, Dr. Ilieva, for a wonderful presentation. Carol Snyder asks, how do we date these ceramics? C14 isotopes, TMR ceramic style. I think the answer is
no.
Easy. And it is ceramic style, I guess. Yes.
Yes. There are no scientific analysis. Well, it depends on which ceramics exactly are meant in the questions, because there are different ceramic groups and styles in the Northern Aegean of the 8th and the 7th century. The one that I've studied in detail, I've conducted some fabric analysis, but they tell us more about production centers, not dating. The dating is exclusively, for the moment, based on context, although clear context and ceramic sequences are very rare, and very often it's stylistic.
Thank you. Are there other questions, comments? Don't see raised hands in the chat. I have a short question to the people who are familiar with the 5th century BC. It's about this information in Herodotus about Phoenicians coming to Tassos and being involved in mining. Could it be that for Herodotus it was simply important to pick one of the myths who were in the air in order to question the Parian connection, the Parian trade partnerships with Tassos? Just to say, you know, they were other people.
You are not the first.
Involved in trade partnerships, whatever, mining, yes, in Tassos. So you Parian guys, you're not the first. That's why be prepared. You might be displaced by someone else. Is this completely crazy, or?
You involve a lot of politics, I think, 5th century politics.
Okay.
But I personally cannot imagine Phoenicians involved in mining on Tassos. I mean, just try to imagine the whole process, the extraction from the very beginning. It needs people to work, and I can't imagine the Phoenicians doing this work. It must have been a lot of
I see a question by Georg Nightingale, if I read it correctly, a raised hand.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Would you allow me to ask, after the glass and bronze beads, where do you place them? Are they actually a trade good, or are they coming along accidentally, rather like trinkets? Or are they something which people really want to acquire as a luxury, as something special, something with connection to the East?
For the moment, judging by the volume of these objects, there are a few more which I didn't put on the slides, but for the moment it doesn't look like a well-organized trade network bringing Eastern Cypriot and Phoenician goods to the Northern Aegean. To my eye, they look more like arriving there either accidentally or as part of a cargo which had other, let's say, Greek objects and some Eastern ones. And even the very fact that there were, especially in the northeastern region, local copies of, let's say, vessels, it means that they must have seen the original to get the idea from somewhere. Again, these are very few in number, so it doesn't look like a regular trade.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Other questions and comments? If not, I have one more. Usually, trade contacts follow know-how. You know, you need a partner somewhere in the island, someone with whom you will who will support you. And also know-how. For example, when the Portuguese go in the Pacific Ocean in the 16th century AD and take metal from Japan and exchange it for silver, for silk from China, they also follow, they don't discover anything, they don't go in completely new, they also follow pre-existing, yes. What can you tell on the basis of the 9th and early 8th century pottery in the North Aegean? What such pre-existing trade partnerships or contacts could be, beyond the obvious suspects, which are Euboea, of course?
Well, it's actually the Euboea, which, judging again mainly by the pottery, because it provides the mass material, let's say. From what I've seen on lemnos published, and not only, I think that the initial link must have been Euboea, and the Rhodian one is probably slightly later, the Eastern Aegean connection, let's say. I don't say that there were no earlier, a late Bronze Age, the ingots, for example, they suggest that this Eastern Aegean route existed, but when it became active again is another matter. Local regional networks and linking the islands and the mainland, of course, they must have existed, although it's not always clear archaeologically. But on a larger scale, we see it in the 7th century. The 8th century material is more, let's say, linked to Euboea rather than Rhodes.
Okay, thank you. Linda Honey asks, have any cult objects been found, Baal or Asherah worship? This might suggest the actual Phoenician presence.
No, nothing so clearly pointing at clearly that we can advocate this presence.
Okay.
There is one figurine with a Phoenician inscription from Stagira, found in the Archaic sanctuary at Stagira, but it's late, it's the 6th century, and I think the situation and the networks in the 6th century are quite different to what we discussed in the late 8th, for example. That's why I didn't bring it into discussion.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I think it's time to end this quite interesting discussion. We thank you for all your questions, for the attention. I enjoyed it really very much. It was pretty interesting to me, and again, we see an interesting episode of becoming cosmopolitan, that it's very difficult to work and to use clear and homogeneous ethnic notions. You know, you are Greek, you are Phoenician, and we divide sites, we divide ships we put them into one or another categories. These categories exist, but as imagined communities, no in real life.
Yeah.
Thank you to all of us. We, on behalf of the Balkan Heritage and the New Bulgarian University, we wish you a very nice summer or winter if you are in the other hemisphere, as Mike, who woke up at 5 o'clock this morning to attend the seminar. Let all of us feel a little bit Phoenician and travel, whether physically or mentally. And we will continue with the seminars. Please check our web pages by mid-end September for the program for next semester. Thank you very much indeed.